Officer Blake Richards sat in his squad car, staring at the clock on his dashboard as the numbers flickered forward in slow motion. The low hum of the engine vibrated through his seat, and he drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, tapping in a rhythmic pattern to ward off the boredom that had settled over him like a heavy blanket. Another night in Bridgeview, another shift in a neighborhood he had long since written off. He glanced out the window at the dimly lit streets. Rows of decaying buildings and shuttered storefronts lined the sidewalks, their neon signs either flickering weakly or completely dead. A few people shuffled past, heads down, shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world had pressed them into submission. Blake sighed heavily, muttering to himself, "Just another 3 hours. Just 3 more." But it felt like an eternity. Bridgeview hadn't always been like this. In his first few years on the force, Blake had held out hope that things could get better. He'd believed in the possibility of change, of making a real difference. But that optimism had faded as time wore on. Now he saw the community as a lost cause, an endless cycle of poverty, crime, and hopelessness. The people here never seemed to want to improve their lives, he thought. They were always looking for someone to blame, someone to carry the burden of their failures. He glanced at the rearview mirror, checking his reflection out of habit. His short-cropped hair was slightly graying at the temples, a reminder of the years he'd spent on the force. He hadn't signed up for this, to be stuck patrolling an area that felt more like a prison than a community. But here he was, night after night, with no excitement and no end in sight. Then something caught his eye. A figure stood outside a small corner store, hunched slightly and holding a plastic grocery bag in one hand. Blake squinted through the windshield. It was a woman, and she didn't seem to fit the usual profile of someone out this late in Bridgeview. She was older, maybe in her mid-60s, and wore a long, oversized coat that seemed to swallow her slight frame. In her other hand, she leaned on a cane, her posture steady but tired. A wide-brimmed hat obscured her face, casting a shadow over her features. To Blake, something about the scene didn't sit right. It was late, too late for someone like her to be standing outside a closed store. He narrowed his eyes. What's she doing out here? Blake's instincts kicked in. He had developed what he liked to call a sense for trouble over the years, a gut feeling that had rarely steered him wrong. This woman, for some reason, triggered that feeling. Without a second thought, he flicked on his headlights, illuminating the street, and pulled his car to the curb. He sat there for a moment, watching, trying to figure out what it was that unsettled him. There was no visible threat, nothing obvious about the woman that screamed danger. But still, he opened his door, the cold night air hitting him as his boots hit the pavement. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night as he crossed the street, heading straight for the woman. As Blake approached, she remained where she was, showing no signs of noticing him. Most people would fidget or glance up nervously when they saw a cop heading their way, but not her. She was different, and that only irritated him more. "Hey!" he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She didn't seem surprised or afraid. "That's all you're carrying?" Blake asked, nodding toward the grocery bag, his voice dripping with suspicion. She nodded once, offering no further explanation. Blake glanced around, making sure no one else was watching too closely, though he could sense the eyes of a few passers-by lingering in the shadows. He had to maintain control. This was his neighborhood to patrol, his streets. But as he looked back at her, the situation seemed to slip further from his grasp. Blake took a step closer, closing the distance between them. The woman's calmness unsettled him. She wasn't reacting like the others did when confronted by a cop. No fidgeting, no quick excuses, just that unnerving calm. It made his blood boil. "Let me see some ID," Blake demanded. The woman reached into her coat pocket slowly, pulling out a small wallet. She handed over her identification without a word, her eyes still locked onto his. Blake scanned the ID. Margaret Harris, it read. No criminal record, no priors, nothing to suggest she was a threat. Blake handed the ID back but lingered, his irritation growing. There was something off about her, something he couldn't put his finger on. Why wasn't she nervous? You shouldn't be out here this late, Blake said, trying to regain control of the situation. I'm just getting home, Margaret replied, her voice steady. Blake felt the tension between them hang in the air. He needed to assert dominance to remind her and himself who was in charge. His frustration mounted, a knot of anger tightening in his chest. You think you're better than me? He spat suddenly, his voice low and threatening. Margaret raised her head slightly, her eyes meeting his without flinching. I never said that. Her calmness, her unshaken demeanor, it all made him furious. Blake stepped closer until there was almost no space between them, his breath hot with anger. I know you're lying, he snapped. What do you see in my eyes, officer? She asked quietly, her gaze unwavering. Blake opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in his career, he felt out of control, as if the power dynamic had shifted. This small, elderly woman had him off balance, and it unnerved him deeply. The street around them remained eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. But the tension between them was thick, suffocating. Blake's mind raced, searching for something to say or do to regain control. Margaret just stood there waiting, not intimidated, not afraid. Blake's fists clenched at his sides. He needed to do something, anything to break the tension, to reassert his authority. Let me tell you something, lady, Blake growled, stepping even closer, his voice filled with barely contained anger. You don't get to talk to me like that. You don't get to act like you're above me. Margaret blinked, her calm, steady gaze never faltering. I'm just trying to get home, Officer Richards. And in that moment, Blake lost control. Blake's heart pounded as he stood mere inches from Margaret, his breath hot and shallow. He didn't know why he felt so angry, so out of control, but it was as if something deep inside him had been triggered by this woman's calmness, her refusal to be intimidated. She wasn't acting like she should, like people usually did when he confronted them. That made him feel powerless, a feeling he despised. Margaret still hadn't moved. Her silence, her unshaken demeanor, it was like a mirror held up to him, reflecting back all his doubts and insecurities. He needed to regain control, to show her who was in charge. And so, in a fit of frustration, he lashed out. Without thinking, Blake grabbed Margaret by the arm, his grip tight, almost bruising. I said, you're not getting out of this that easy, he snarled, his voice barely a whisper now, the rage simmering just below the surface. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at him, her expression still calm, but with a touch of something else. Pity, maybe? It enraged him further. Blake's chest heaved with anger. He tightened his grip, leaning in closer. You're not above the law. You hear me? I hear you, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady, almost serene. And that was when Blake snapped. In a blur of anger, he pushed her back, his shove more forceful than he'd intended. Margaret stumbled, her cane slipping from her hand, and she fell hard onto the pavement. The sound of her body hitting the ground was louder than it should have been, echoing in Blake's ears like a gunshot. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. For a second, Blake just stood there, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He couldn't believe what he'd just done. He had never meant to push her that hard, never meant for things to go this far. Margaret lay still on the ground for a moment, her wide-brimmed hat knocked off her head, revealing a streak of silver hair. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up onto her hand and knees. There was a trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth, but she didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse him. Instead, she wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, picked up her cane, and stood back up with quiet dignity. Her movements were slow, but there was no mistaking the strength in them. Blake felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be afraid, to submit to his authority. Not this. This quiet resilience that made him feel like he was the one in the wrong. Margaret stood there, her eyes locking onto his once again. She was breathing heavily, but her expression remained calm, controlled. It was as if she had expected this outcome all along, as if she knew something he didn't. You, Blake began, his voice faltering. You should have listened to me. Margaret's gaze softened slightly, but it wasn't pity that filled her eyes this time. It was something far deeper, something Blake couldn't quite place. "You didn't need to do this, Officer Richards," she said softly. Blake blinked, his hands shaking. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to fix this. His mind raced, trying to come up with some explanation, some excuse for what had just happened. But nothing seemed to make sense anymore. Just as Blake was about to turn and walk away, run away, more like it, Margaret spoke again, her voice calm but commanding. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, her gaze never wavering. Blake turned back to face her, confusion and frustration boiling beneath the surface. "What are you talking about?" Margaret straightened her coat, brushing off the dirt from her fall. Then from the inside pocket of her coat, she pulled out a gold badge that gleamed in the dim streetlight. Blake's heart stopped. "Margaret Harris," she said, her voice firm now, no longer soft. "Special agent with the FBI." Blake's world spun. His mind reeled as he stared at the badge in her hand. An FBI agent? He had just assaulted an undercover FBI agent? No, this couldn't be happening. This had to be some kind of trick, some kind of setup. But the badge gleamed in the light, cold and undeniable. Blake staggered back a step, his breath hitching in his throat. You're lying," he stammered. But the words felt hollow even as he said them. Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, Officer Richards, I'm not." Blake's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him like a tidal wave. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was no way to take back the push, no way to erase the fact that he had just assaulted a federal agent. What do you want from me?" Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You're going to be held accountable for your actions, Officer Richards. The law applies to everyone, even you." Blake swallowed hard, the fear rising in his chest like a vice tightening around his heart. He felt trapped, cornered, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fight his way out. It didn't take long for the video of the altercation to surface. A bystander had captured the entire confrontation on their phone, and within hours it was circulating on social media. The image of Blake pushing Margaret to the ground, the moment of impact, in the reveal of her FBI badge. Everything was out there for the world to see. Bridgeview erupted in outrage. The community, already on edge from years of strained relations with the police, was now a powder keg ready to explode. The local news picked up the story, then national outlets, and soon the entire country was watching. Blake's world collapsed in on itself. His fellow officers distanced themselves, and his superiors, desperate to avoid further scrutiny, suspended him without pay pending an internal investigation. But Blake knew it was worse than that, much worse. He was being investigated by the Now, and not just for the assault. Margaret Harris had been conducting an undercover operation, investigating corruption within the Bridgeview Police Department, and Blake had just walked straight into the middle of it. Blake sat in his apartment, staring at the news as they replayed the footage again and again. His phone had been ringing nonstop, calls from reporters, from angry community members, even from his own family. He ignored them all, his mind numb from the shock of what was happening. He felt like he was drowning. Every part of his life was unraveling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His thoughts turned to Lieutenant Greg Hanley, his superior, the man who had protected him for years. Hanley had always been there for him, covering up minor infractions, smoothing things over whenever a complaint came in. But Blake knew that protection came with a price. And now, with the FBI involved, Hanley was going to make sure Blake stayed silent. Blake picked up his phone and stared at it, his finger hovering over Hanley's number. He didn't know what to do. Hanley would demand his loyalty, just as he always had. But this time, Blake wasn't sure if he could give it. This time, the stakes were too high. As his hand trembled, Blake finally made the call. Blake sat in his dark apartment, the phone pressed to his ear, waiting for Lieutenant Hanley to pick up. The seconds stretched on like hours, the dull ringing in his ear, the only sound in the room. Finally, a click echoed on the line, followed by Hanley's gruff voice. "Richards," Hanley said, his tone clipped. "I've been hearing a lot of noise about you. What the hell did you do?" Blake swallowed, his throat dry. "It's bad, Hanley. Real bad. I didn't know who she was." There was a long pause on the other end, and Blake could almost hear Hanley piecing the situation together in his mind. "What do you mean, didn't know who she was?" "She's FBI," Blake whispered, his voice cracking. "I pushed her. I didn't know, Hanley, I swear." The silence on the other end was suffocating, and when Hanley spoke again, his voice was low and menacing. "You've really done it this time, Richards." Blake clenched the phone tighter, his knuckles white. "What do I do? They're investigating. They're going to find everything." Hanley's response was calm, too calm. "Keep your mouth shut. I'll handle this." Blake's heart raced, but there was a sliver of hope in Hanley's words. If anyone could fix this, it was him. Hanley had always been able to cover things up, make problems disappear. But this time, something felt different. This time, Blake wasn't sure if even Hanley could make this go away. "You just keep quiet, Richard," Hanley repeated. "I'll take care of it." Blake hung up the phone, his hands shaking. He wanted to believe Hanley, but the pit in his stomach told him this was beyond even his superior's reach. Across town, Margaret sat at her desk in the FBI's temporary office, reviewing the files she had collected over the past months. The Bridgeview Police Department had been on her radar for a while now. Officers like Blake Richards were part of a much larger problem, a culture of corruption and abuse of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. She rubbed her bruised cheek, wincing slightly at the tenderness. The confrontation with Blake had left its mark, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll of this case. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that had been allowed to rot from the inside, and Margaret was determined to bring it down. Her supervisor, Special Agent Daniel Cole, entered the room, his expression serious. He handed her a folder, the latest reports from the field agents. "We've got enough to take them down," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of excitement. Margaret opened the folder, flipping through the pages. The evidence was damning. Complaints of police brutality, excessive force, racial profiling, all swept under the rug by Hanley and his inner circle. Blake Richards was just the latest piece of the puzzle, but he wasn't the endgame. "Hanley's the real target," Margaret said, her voice steady. "We can't take down the whole system without him." Cole nodded. "We're getting close. But you know how this works. It's going to take time, and we need someone from the inside." Margaret closed the folder, her mind already working through the next steps. Blake Richards could be that person. He was desperate, cornered. If they played their cards right, they could flip him, make him testify against Hanley. But it wouldn't be easy. Hanley had a grip on his officers, a grip that wouldn't loosen without a fight. Blake sat on his couch staring at the television screen, though he wasn't really watching. His mind was a storm of confusion and fear. The FBI was closing in, and Hanley's voice echoed in his head. "Keep your mouth shut." But the weight of the situation was crushing him. Margaret Harris was an FBI agent, and she wasn't just investigating him. She was investigating the entire department. If he didn't do something, he knew it was only a matter of time before they found out everything. Every bribe he had taken, every corner he had cut, every law he had bent to fit his own needs. Blake knew he couldn't run from this. He had two choices: stay loyal to Hanley and hope for the best, or cooperate with the FBI and save himself from a worse fate. Neither option felt good, but one of them felt inevitable. Just as he was about to make the decision that would change everything, there was a knock at his door. Blake's heart jumped into his throat. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky as he approached the door. When he opened it, there stood two FBI agents. One of them held up a badge, the other a stern expression. "Officer Richards, we need to talk." Blake sat in a cold, sterile room at the FBI field office, his hands trembling in his lap. Across from him sat Margaret Harris, her bruised cheek a stark reminder of their last encounter. Beside her was Special Agent Daniel Cole, who regarded Blake with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "We know what's going on in your department," Cole began, his voice calm but firm. "We've been investigating for months, and we know that Lieutenant Hanley has been protecting you and other officers like you." Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Margaret, but her expression was unreadable. "We're giving you an opportunity," Cole continued. "Cooperate with us, testify against Hanley, and we can help you." Blake's head spun. Testify against Hanley? The thought was terrifying. Hanley wasn't just his boss. He was a powerful man with connections, and Blake knew what he was capable of. But the alternative was worse. If he stayed loyal to Hanley, he'd be going down with him, and there would be no escape. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but with an underlying intensity. "This is your chance, Blake. You can make this right. But you need to decide now." Blake's chest tightened. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the room was suffocating. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. But one thing was clear. There was no way out of this that wouldn't cost him something. Blake started, his voice trembling. "I need to think." Cole nodded, but Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't have much time," she said quietly. Blake sat in a cold, sterile room at the FBI field office, his hands trembling in his lap. Across from him sat Margaret Harris, her bruised cheek a stark reminder of their last encounter. Beside her was Special Agent Daniel Cole, who regarded Blake with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "We know what's going on in your department," Cole began, his voice calm but firm. "We've been investigating for months, and we know that Lieutenant Hanley has been protecting you and other officers like you." Blake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He glanced at Margaret, but her expression was unreadable. "We're giving you an opportunity," Cole continued. "Cooperate with us, testify against Hanley, and we can help you." Blake's head spun. Testify against Hanley? The thought was terrifying. Hanley wasn't just his boss. He was a powerful man with connections, and Blake knew what he was capable of. But the alternative was worse. If he stayed loyal to Hanley, he'd be going down with him, and there would be no escape. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice calm, but with an underlying intensity. "This is your chance, Blake. You can make this right. But you need to decide now." Blake's chest tightened. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the room was suffocating. He could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him. But one thing was clear. There was no way out of this that wouldn't cost him something. Blake started, his voice trembling. "I need to think." Cole nodded, but Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't have much time," she said quietly. The call ended, and Blake stood there, the silence around him deafening. His hands trembled as he realized the gravity of his situation. He was stuck in a web of corruption, with no way out that didn't lead to someone getting hurt, including himself. But deep down, Blake knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep running from this. The time for decisions was coming, and fast. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her office, reviewing the latest updates from her team. The investigation was progressing, but they needed someone from the inside to flip. Blake Richards was their best shot, but Margaret knew he was scared. She could see it in his eyes during their meeting. She sighed, rubbing her bruised cheek again, wincing slightly. She had seen men like Blake before. Officers who had started out with good intentions, but had gotten caught up in the system, corrupted by the power and protection it offered. But Blake was different. There was still a chance for him, if he chose to take it. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up. It was Cole. "We need to move on Hanley soon," he said, his voice tense. "If Blake doesn't flip, we could lose everything." Margaret's heart sank. She knew the clock was ticking, but she wasn't ready to give up on Blake yet. "Give him time," she said quietly. "He'll come around." As she hung up the phone, Margaret stared out the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She knew the fight for justice was far from over, but she had faith that they would succeed. They had to. Blake paced his apartment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, silent but looming. Hanley's voice still echoed in his head. "You know what happens to rats?" The threat was clear, and Blake had no doubt that Hanley would follow through if pushed. Blake glanced at the news on TV. The story of Margaret's assault had exploded. The city of Bridgeview was on edge, with protests breaking out demanding justice for years of police corruption. Blake's face was plastered across every channel, labeled as another symbol of a broken system. He turned the volume down, but the images on the screen remained. The confrontation, the punch, Margaret's calm reveal of her FBI badge. It was all out there for the world to see. Blake clenched his fists, his heart racing. His life was falling apart, but more than that, his entire identity as a police officer was unraveling. Was this who he had become? A bully in uniform? Someone who lashed out at an elderly woman because she wouldn't show fear? He sat down heavily on the couch, head in his hands. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now it felt like he had lost everything. No matter what choice he made, loyalty to Hanley or cooperating with the FBI, his life would never be the same. The decision weighed on him. The FBI had made it clear that they needed his testimony to take down Lieutenant Greg Hanley. But Blake knew that testifying would mean burning every bridge he had ever built in the force. Hanley had power, and that power stretched far beyond the precinct walls. If he flipped, he'd be turning his back on everything and everyone he had known for years. But the alternative was worse. If he stayed loyal to Hanley, he would go down with him. Margaret had shown him the evidence they had: files of police brutality complaints, misconduct reports, bribes, all covered up by Hanley's network. The FBI had a mountain of evidence, and Blake knew it was only a matter of time before they had enough to bring everyone down, including him. Blake's phone buzzed on the counter, and for a moment his heart stopped. He picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. "We need to meet, now." Blake hesitated, but something told him this was from Hanley. His hands trembled as he quickly typed a response, agreeing to meet at a secluded spot near the docks. He had to confront Hanley face to face. He had to know if there was any way out. Later that night, Blake drove to the docks, his mind racing with scenarios of what would happen next. When he arrived, he saw Hanley standing in the shadows, smoking a cigarette. The moment Blake stepped out of his car, Hanley tossed the cigarette aside and walked toward him. "You've put me in a tight spot, Richards," Hanley said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. "This FBI thing, it's bigger than you realize. They're not just after me, they're after all of us." Blake swallowed hard. "What do you want from me, Lieutenant?" Hanley stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Loyalty. You've always been loyal, Richards. Don't start changing that now. We're in this together. If you keep your mouth shut, I'll make sure you come out of this clean." Blake felt a pit in his stomach. Hanley's words were tempting, but deep down, he knew they were empty promises. There was no coming out of this clean. Not anymore. "I can't, Hanley," Blake finally said, his voice breaking. "They've got too much. They're not just going after you. They're going after the whole precinct. It's over." For a moment, Hanley's calm facade cracked. His eyes darkened and his jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake, Richards. You talk and you're done. You won't just lose your badge. You'll lose everything. You think the FBI is going to protect you? They'll use you and toss you aside. But if you stay with me, I can guarantee your safety." Blake's heart pounded in his chest, the pressure of the moment weighing on him. He had looked up to Hanley for years, but now he saw the truth. Hanley was a sinking ship, and anyone who stayed with him was going down too. "I'm sorry," Blake whispered, stepping back. "I can't do this anymore." Hanley's face twisted with rage, but before he could say another word, Blake turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his ears. It was done. He had made his choice. Blake sat in the FBI office the next morning, staring at the papers in front of him. Margaret sat across from him, her expression unreadable. Special Agent Daniel Cole stood behind her, his arms crossed as he waited for Blake to speak. "I'll testify," Blake said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded, a slight hint of relief crossing her face. "You're making the right choice." Blake felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Was this really the right choice? He wasn't sure anymore, but it was the only choice he had left. "We'll protect you," Cole said, stepping forward. "We'll make sure Hanley doesn't touch you." Blake clenched his fists, doubt gnawing at the edges of his mind. "What about my family? What about everyone else involved?" "We'll take care of them too," Margaret assured him, "but you have to trust us." Blake didn't trust anyone anymore, but he had no other option. He signed the papers, his hand trembling with the weight of what he had just agreed to. He had just put a target on his back, and he knew it. The next few days were a blur of tension and fear. Blake was moved to a safe house, and the FBI kept him under constant surveillance. But the threat of Hanley's retaliation loomed over him like a dark cloud. Blake could barely sleep, his mind replaying the confrontation at the docks over and over. Hanley had made it clear, if Blake talked, he would pay the price. And now there was no turning back. One night, just as Blake was drifting into a restless sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, fearing the worst. The message was simple. "You're dead." Blake's blood ran cold. He sat up in bed, his heart racing. Hanley had made his move. Blake called Margaret immediately, his voice shaking. "He's coming after me. I just got a threat." Margaret's voice was calm on the other end. "We've got eyes on you, Blake. You're safe. But we need to act fast. Hanley knows his time is running out." Blake's chest tightened with fear, but there was nothing he could do now. He had to trust that Margaret and the FBI could protect him. But deep down, he knew Hanley wouldn't go down without a fight. Blake sat at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall of the safe house. Every sound, every creak, every car passing by set his nerves on edge. He knew Hanley was out there, plotting, waiting for the right moment to strike. The threat from the night before still weighed heavily on his mind, and no amount of assurances from Margaret or the FBI could shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like a shadow. Margaret and Special Agent Daniel Cole had been working around the clock, gathering evidence and preparing to move against Lieutenant Hanley. The FBI had managed to get enough information from Blake to make a solid case, but the operation wasn't without risk. Hanley was deeply connected, and they needed to take him down in a way that left no room for loopholes. Margaret entered the room, her expression calm but focused. "We're moving in on Hanley tonight," she said. "This is it, Blake. It's all going to be over soon." Blake nodded, though his hand still trembled. "Are you sure you've got everything you need? He won't go down easily." Margaret gave a reassuring nod. "We've got enough. The burner phones he used, the bribery network, and now your testimony. We just need to execute the operation." Blake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, he felt a strange sense of calm settling over him. It wasn't relief. There was still too much at stake for that, but it was a quiet understanding that his part in this was almost done. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay here. We've got agents on every exit. You'll be safe." Blake met her eyes and nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if anyone could truly guarantee his safety. Later that night, the FBI team assembled outside the precinct, their dark SUVs blending into the shadows. Margaret, dressed in full tactical gear, stood with Special Agent Cole and the rest of the team. The atmosphere was tense. This was the moment they had been working toward for months. If anything went wrong, Hanley could slip through their fingers. Cole glanced at Margaret as they prepared to move in. "We've got eyes on Hanley. He's inside with a few other officers. Once we breach, we need to secure him quickly." Margaret nodded, her heart racing. She had faced dangerous situations before, but this felt different. Hanley was desperate, and desperation made people unpredictable. Still, she had faith in the team. They had prepared for this. "Let's do this," Margaret said, signaling the team forward. The tactical team moved in quickly, breaching the precinct's side entrance. They moved through the dark corridors in silence, their steps quick and precise. Margaret's pulse quickened as they neared Hanley's office. She could hear faint voices from inside. Cole motioned for the team to spread out, positioning themselves at the door. Margaret took a deep breath, gripping her weapon tightly. This was it. On Cole's signal, the team stormed into the office, weapons drawn. "FBI, hands in the air." Lieutenant Hanley stood behind his desk, his expression cold and calculating as the agents swarmed the room. His eyes met Margaret's for a split second, and she saw the flash of recognition. But he didn't seem surprised. It was as if he had been expecting this. Slowly, Hanley raised his hands, his expression never wavering. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Margaret stepped forward, her gaze locked on Hanley. "It's over, Hanley." He smirked, his eyes narrowing. "It's never over, Agent Harris. You'll never take down the whole system. I'm just one piece of it." Margaret clenched her jaw but said nothing. She knew better than to engage him in a battle of words. The evidence they had collected would speak for itself. "Turn around," she ordered, her voice firm. Hanley hesitated for a moment before complying, allowing the agents to cuff him. As they led him out of the office, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Hanley was right. He was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but this was a start. The news of Hanley's arrest spread quickly, and Bridgeview was once again at the center of national attention. The FBI's operation had exposed a network of corruption within the police department that went far beyond Hanley. Officers had been taking bribes, covering up crimes, and abusing their power for years, all under the protection of their corrupt leadership. As the media frenzy swirled, Blake watched from the safe house, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. He had played a part in bringing down Hanley, but his own actions weren't something he could easily forget. He had been part of that system too, and it had taken him far too long to see the truth. Margaret visited him the day after the raid, her expression unreadable as she sat across from him. "It's over," she said simply. Blake nodded, though the weight of everything still hung heavy on his shoulders. "And what happens to me now?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "You're going to face consequences, Blake. You're not off the hook, but your cooperation helped us take down Hanley. That counts for something." Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, I don't know how to make it right." Margaret's gaze softened slightly. "You took a step in the right direction. That's a start." In the weeks that followed, the FBI's investigation into the Bridgeview Police Department expanded. More officers were arrested, and the city began the slow process of rebuilding trust with the community. It wasn't easy. Years of corruption and abuse had left deep scars, but there was a sense of hope that things could change. Blake faced his own reckoning. He was stripped of his badge and charged with multiple offenses, including assault and misconduct. But his cooperation with the FBI had earned him some leniency, and he was given a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against Hanley and other corrupt officers. As he stood in the courtroom, hearing the judge read out his sentence, Blake felt a strange sense of closure. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would turn out, but in a way it felt like justice. He had made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. After the trial, Margaret found him outside the courthouse. She didn't say much, just a nod of acknowledgement before walking away. But in that brief moment, Blake knew that she understood. They had both fought their battles, and in the end, justice had been served. Margaret stood at the window of her new office, looking out at the city below. Bridgeview had changed in the months since Hanley's arrest. There were still protests, still demands for deeper reform, but there was also a sense of progress. The corruption that had festered for so long was finally being addressed. The fight wasn't over. Margaret knew that. There were still systems to dismantle, still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Special Agent Daniel Cole. "We've got another case. Same problem, different city." Margaret sighed, slipping the phone into her pocket. There would always be another case, another fight. But she was ready. She had faced worse, and she had come out stronger. Weeks after the trial, Blake sat alone in a small park not far from his childhood home. The leaves rustled gently in the wind, the peaceful setting a stark contrast to the turmoil that had been his life over the last few months. He was out on bail, waiting for the final sentencing and trying to come to terms with everything that had happened. Blake couldn't stop thinking about how things had gone so wrong. He had joined the police force with good intentions. He had wanted to protect and serve, to make a difference in his community. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of that. The pressure, the culture, and his own unchecked anger had twisted him into someone he barely recognized. Now he was facing the consequences of those choices. The sound of footsteps approached, and Blake looked up to see Margaret walking toward him. She had been one of the few people he hadn't expected to see again after the trial. But there she was, calm and composed as always. "Mind if I join you?" Margaret asked, her voice quiet but kind. Blake nodded, gesturing to the empty spot on the bench beside him. They sat in silence for a moment, the wind carrying the faint sound of children playing in the distance. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. You've been through a lot, she said, her tone measured. I don't want to downplay what you did. There's no excusing it. But you made a choice to help us take down Hanley. That matters. Blake stared at the ground, his heart heavy. I'm not sure if it was enough. I was part of the problem. Margaret glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. You were, but you can choose to be part of the solution now. Blake sighed. I just, I don't know where to start. You already started, Margaret replied. You faced the truth. That's more than a lot of people can say. For the first time in what felt like forever, Blake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. As time passed, the ripple effects of the FBI's investigation into the Bridgeview Police Department began to be felt. The corrupt officers were gone, replaced by new leadership committed to transparency and accountability. But it was clear that the road to rebuilding trust with the community would be long and difficult. Protests continued, though their focus had shifted from outrage to advocacy for change. Community leaders met with the new police leadership, discussing reforms, including better training for officers and an independent oversight board to handle complaints. The changes were incremental, but they were happening. Margaret watched from the sidelines. Her work in Bridgeview technically finished, but she couldn't walk away just yet. She had invested too much in this case, and she wanted to make sure that the changes were real. She met with Chief Emma Davis, the new head of the Bridgeview Police Department, a no-nonsense woman who had a reputation for integrity. Margaret had been impressed with her so far, but she knew the real test would be whether Davis could follow through on her promises. I know it's going to take time, Davis said, her tone serious as they sat in her office, but we're committed to seeing this through. We owe it to the people we serve. Margaret nodded. Just don't lose sight of that. The community has been burned too many times. They need to see real change. We'll make it happen, Davis promised. Margaret left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. Bridgeview was changing, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a start. Blake's sentencing was lighter than it could have been, thanks to his cooperation with the FBI. He was sentenced to several years of probation in order to complete community service. He would never wear a badge again, and he would have to live with the knowledge that his actions had hurt the very people he had sworn to protect. But he had avoided prison, and for that he was grateful. He threw himself into his community service, working with at-risk youth in the same neighborhoods he had once patrolled. It was humbling work, and at first the people he worked with didn't trust him. They knew who he was, what he had done. But slowly, over time, Blake began to build new relationships. He didn't expect forgiveness, he didn't deserve it, but he was determined to earn back at least some level of respect. One day, as he was packing up after a long day at the community center, a young man approached him. "You're that cop, right?" the boy asked, his tone curious but not hostile. Blake tensed. "I was." The boy shrugged. "I heard what happened. You did some bad stuff, but at least you tried to make it right." Not everyone does that. Blake didn't know what to say. The words were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't expected. "Thanks," Blake finally said, feeling a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to make a difference. Margaret stood in front of the wall of photos in the FBI office. Images of corrupt officers, community leaders, and victims of police brutality. Each face told a story, and each story had played a part in the larger narrative of the Bridgeview case. She had fought hard to bring justice to these people, and she had succeeded, at least in part. But Margaret knew that the fight was far from over. There were more cities like Bridgeview, more corrupt officers, and more communities suffering under the weight of broken systems. Her work was never done, and she was ready for whatever came next. As she packed up her files and prepared to move on to the next case, Margaret took one last look at the wall of faces. She felt a deep sense of pride in what they had accomplished, but also a profound sadness for the many lives that had been lost or destroyed along the way. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Special Agent Daniel Cole. "Next case is in Detroit. Same problems. Ready?" Margaret smiled to herself. She was ready. Bridgeview was still a city in transition, but there were signs of healing. The protests had shifted from anger to advocacy, with community leaders working hand in hand with the new police leadership to create a safer, more equitable future. The scars of the past were still visible, but they were no longer raw. In a small cafe near the center of town, a group of young activists gathered to discuss the next steps in their fight for justice. Among them was Tyrone Jackson, one of the most vocal leaders of the protests that had erupted after Blake's assault on Margaret. Tyrone had been skeptical of the new police reforms at first, but over time, he had seen real changes. "We've still got a lot of work to do," Tyrone said, his voice passionate. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're being heard." His words were met with nods of agreement from the others at the table. Across town, Blake stood outside the community center, watching the kids play basketball on the court. He had never imagined his life would take this turn, but here he was, trying to rebuild his life in his community, one day at a time. And in her office, Margaret sat at her desk, reviewing files for the next case. The fight for justice was never ending, but she was ready for the next challenge. She always would be. Months had passed since Lieutenant Hanley's arrest, and Bridgeview was beginning to look like a different city. The community had come together in ways no one had expected. And while there was still much work to be done, there was a sense of hope that hadn't been there before. Blake walked down the street, his head held a little higher than it had been in recent months. He wasn't proud of his past, but he was learning to live with it. Every day was a chance to do better, to make up for the harm he had caused. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never go back to the man he had been. He was moving forward step by step, and that was enough. Margaret, too, was moving forward. As she boarded a plane for Detroit, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Bridgeview wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and that was all she needed to keep going. The fight for justice was long, and the road was hard. But for Margaret, Blake, and the people of Bridgeview, the future was brighter than it had been in a long time. Together, they were moving forward, and that was what mattered most.